Thank you, Ken. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I mean, it's the Mutual Appreciation Society about to start here, but Ken's work has influenced me hugely over the decades too. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. What I want to do is to talk about the work that I've done on relational expertise and start by thinking about something that I know Ken and a number of you have been working on, really questioning whose knowledge counts in teacher preparation and school development. So that is going to be sort of threaded through what I'm trying to do, and I hope come to some kind of resolution towards the end. I'm going to be talking about what I'm calling the relational turn. So core ideas of relational expertise, common knowledge and relational agency. These are the ideas I've been working with, and I'll spend some time on that, and there will be some of the kind of theoretical underpinning of those ideas that I want to take you through from a cultural, historical, sociocultural perspective. And then I want to get down to some of the practicalities of building common knowledge using relational expertise for education, and to do that in the context of some work that we've been doing in Oxford in the Department of Education in terms of our relationships between our schools and the university as a whole, not just the Department of Education. So that's the outline. These are the questions. And this is the homework that Ken set me, really. How might relational expertise help build community-university relationships? I'm going to just throw some ideas out about that, and obviously you'll understand your context much better. But how do we build and use relational expertise? And I see relational expertise as a capacity that can be developed and used. And then why should we? What's the point? It's hard, it's hard work. Is it rewarding? What are the benefits? So those are the kinds of questions I want to sort of like you to keep in mind. I understand this is going to be available on some intranet, so you will be able to get them. So I don't know about you, but I get so fed up with people who think they know about teacher education and say it doesn't work because you can't apply university knowledge in schools. Well, I don't know about you, but I don't think I've met a teacher educator in decades who thinks that's what they're doing much more sophisticated work than that. Maybe you might want to pull some of that out in the questions. Also, and this is where we've got to largely in the UK, teacher education, well, all the knowledge that counts is in the practices. So let's just put potential teachers, beginning teachers, into the practices. Don't even need university, really. It'd be nice if they validated some of the things we do. That's growing and growing and growing in the UK, very heavily. And I think there are a lot of arguments against that, which we might want to discuss a bit later. But for me, joint knowledge generation is what I think we ought to be thinking about in teacher education. That's quite a holistic view. And so we're thinking about knowledge generation for student teachers, developing their understanding of what's going on, knowledge generation for teachers, knowledge generation for schools as units themselves, as sets of practices, knowledge generation among university faculty. And I think we have such huge potential in teacher education for really breaking new ground in this. In the UK, we have something called the Research Excellence Framework, which is an assessment of the quality of our research. And one strong element, about 30% of the overall profile that really matters because it brings in core funding into departments, is on the impact of our research. And the kind of model that I'm going to be talking about plays right into that impact agenda. It's about working with the knowledge that's in the field and the knowledge in the university, bringing it together in ways that is forward-looking for all of these groups of people. So that's really lying behind some of the ideas I'm going to talk about, and I think it's the partial answer already to Ken's question about which knowledge counts. Okay, so that's what I'm going to try and do. I'm going to take you quite briefly through some of the theory that's lying behind how we've tried to answer that question, the joint knowledge generation question. And I'm going to take you through the theory, and then we'll get to how we've used the theory. I work very much within the field that I prefer to call cultural historical approach to learning. Activity theory is part of that field, sociocultural approaches that focus more on language are part of that field, and it goes back to the work of Lev Vygotsky in Russia in the late 20s and early 30s. Fascinating time when Stalin was growing in power, very dangerous time, and what Vygotsky was trying to do was to create a Marxist psychology in the sense that he wanted to give people tools that they could use to make society better. So it's a reforming psychology, which I think fits well with the kind of thing a number of us are trying to do in terms of making a difference with our research. So some key concepts. The 6 volumes of Vygotsky's writing put down onto 2 slides. So but anyway, some of the key things. First of all, key message. Learning arises in a dialectical relationship between person and practice as they take actions in activities, in practices. That has implications for us as researchers because we want to look at what people do in activities, in practices, and why they do them, how they do them. And it helps us understand what we mean by active learning. If we think about learning arising as people take actions, are agentic, take actions in these activities and in practices, and it's a dialectical relationship, so the agency comes in, but the practice, the activities are also making demands on the learner. That's how we get the dialectic. It means we have to pay attention to the demands in the practices as well as what the learner brings. Now this is pretty crucial when thinking about teacher education because I know from my DPhil student, PhD students' work, when they come back with accounts of how our student teachers are placed in schools and the demands that have been placed on them during teaching practicums, bear no relation at all to the demands that we think are being placed on them. And so this becomes really quite an important thing to focus on, and that's part of the thinking that was behind the developments that I'm going to talk about later in Oxford. Another key thing is that learning involves using cultural tools in increasingly informed ways. Now this in a way plays back into, well yes, you do learn ideas in university that you apply in school, yes you do, but it's about using them in culturally informed ways, being able to understand the culture, using them when they are appropriate, not simply blindly applying them. And again, I'll happily expand on these if it's not clear during question time. So the cultural tools are really very, very important aspect of thinking about Vygotskian work. We know that personal knowledge, so the knowledge of the student teacher, for example, is generated when they use tools in activities. As part of that dialectic, they're generating personal knowledge, which is exactly what we want them to do. The kind of knowledge they generate will very much depend on the demands that we made on them. So that's the learning, the student has learned an element of that. But we also need to recognise, again from Vygotsky's work, that different cultures and practices refine tools differently for different purposes. And the knowledge they produce can therefore be different. I've got a picture up here from another DPhil student's site work. And here, I'm going to give you an example that's not teacher education, just so that you understand what I'm talking about. This is a school in Rajasthan where the kids are, in this particular exercise are learning about area and measurement. And they're families, their farming families, have a very effective way of measuring their fields to do with a particular kind of pacing that they do and using sticks. And that works, and it's worked for generations. And so it's a cultural tool that is effective within that particular village. But what the challenge for the school is, of course, is to help them understand the need for having stable forms of measurement that you can use in different settings. Now we can take that kind of thing into thinking about what happens in schools, and I don't want to in any way imply that schools are like Indian rural villages using primitive methods, but just to say that there are things happening in these different environments, universities and schools, that mean that the cultural resources are shaped in different ways to suit local needs, and that's very, very important. Now we can fall into the trap that I try to avoid falling into, of thinking, well, the university knowledge, the school, in this particular case, the primary school in Rajasthan's knowledge is superior to the other knowledge. And I think we have to be very careful to ensure that that doesn't happen. We need to think about which knowledge counts most, or is that even a valid question? How does each knowledge count? What does each kind of knowledge, what does each kind of cultural resource bring to the learning environment? So that's Vygotsky, done in 5 minutes. So I now want to get on to clarifying some of the language. When I talk about practices coming out of a cultural, historical perspective, I see practices as inhabited. So practices aren't what I do. I walk into practices that have histories. And those of you who know Mike Cole's work down in San Diego will know it's exactly the same way he talks about it. And practices then, for me, are historically accumulated. So the history of practices is crucially important, and we can't underestimate that when we think about our student teachers going out into schools and into communities. They're knowledge-laden, emotionally freighted, the emotion in the practice, things that we hold dear that we wouldn't want to give up on, and are given direction by what's valued by those of us who are in the practices. So when a student teacher walks into a school or into a community placement, they have to read a lot. They have to try and understand that. And you'll be aware of quite how confused they get by that. Feeling they've got to serve 2 masters or mistresses at the university, and the school comes up. It's been coming up all the time I've been doing work on teacher education. Okay, so what matters in practices is very important, and I'm going to be emphasising the what matters, the motives, the values, the what's held dear that gives those practices shape and keeps them there and keeps people engaged with them. Now, I'm going to emphasise practices, and I'm going to be talking about what we're doing in Oxford in terms of sites of intersecting practices, because that's how we've been thinking about what we're doing. Now, I know that a number of people here have been very influenced by the lovely work. I think it's lovely work of Engestrom, who's a friend of mine. I mean, I really appreciate his work hugely. And thinking about creating new hybrid spaces using Engestrom's interacting activity systems. And I think there's quite a lot to be said for doing that. What my concern is that two concerns. One is that one can end up with an awful lot of these Engestronian triangles dancing all over the place. Apart from actually how impossible it is to put it on the slide, it is also quite possible to, very, very difficult to keep a grip on it. I also, just part of the same first point, that it tends to emphasise the boundaries. These are quite boundaried systems. The second point, is that, and Engestrom is really careful about this, this shared object, which one might assume is a student-teacher's learning trajectory, one might assume. I've never found it to be, actually, in my research, is potentially, and he's really careful to put that word potential. And so, just for example, a study that, a paper that I wrote, which is called Teaching by Proxy, showed that what this particular partnership between university and a set of schools was convinced that they got that going. And then when we actually dug into what was happening when the student teachers were with the teacher in this particular activity system of the primary school, elementary school, what the object was not the student teachers learning at all. The student teacher was almost like a kind of puppet. You've got to get this group through this by then, you've got to get that group by then. You moved a bit slowly with them, they could go much faster. They ought to be on page 24 by now. I mean, this was the kind of feedback that they were getting, because the object of activity, the problem space the teacher was working on, quite understandably, was the progress of the students in her class. This, I think what this does is sort of throw up some really interesting questions, but I don't find it particularly useful in terms of answering questions about knowledge generation, about whose knowledge is valuable, and I also don't find it hugely helpful in terms of thinking about how we manage these kinds of partnerships. But that's because I've struggled through it for a very, very long time, trying to see whether it actually works. So what I want to offer you, and I'm aware that some people are standing at the back and there are also a few chairs if would you like to sit? I'd hate to be standing for the next hour. The two chairs here.
One back here.
Yeah. Okay. You're coming round the other way. I'm not leaving. Good. Okay. So, what I prefer to work with is to think about these different practices of schooling and university, for example, or community, coming together at what I call a site of intersecting practices, where the different what matters, the different values, the different motives can come together so that people can work on problems in which they are stakeholders, and where the knowledge in each practice counts, and what people are bringing is something that has the potential to be valuable to the discussion about the problem that they're working on. One of the this notion of site of intersecting practice developed when we were looking at some multi-professional working, multi-agency working, a big project about 10 years ago. And I thought what was being created when people came together to do complex work around vulnerable families and children was an activity system. And the more I looked at our data, the more I thought, this isn't an activity system. It hasn't got a history, it hasn't got a sense of permanence, different people are coming in and out all the time. Yeah, they've got a kind of, for the moment, they've got a kind of shared problem that they're working on, but their actual activity systems are back in the social work department or in the school or in the health visiting unit. And so I wanted to find something that allowed me to think about what was actually happening on the ground in it and in our data. One of the things about being a big-got-skin person is that you're constantly holding ideas against the data and refining the ideas, trying to create ways of explaining what's going on that allow other people to also conceptualize them in similar ways and test the ideas. So this notion of the site of intersecting practice is something that I've taken from the work on multi-professional work into thinking about what we're doing in Oxford, which I'll come to eventually. So the questions then that then came out of recognising these sites of intersecting practices was what happens in them? How do they work? And I was lucky enough to have a number of projects, again, of multi-professional working in communities. And so could ask these kind of questions. So what happens at the intersection when people work on complex problems? What goes on? What happens? How are the motives in each of these different practices aligned. And by aligned, I don't mean become one, but can sit alongside each other in compatible ways. So that the interprofessional work can be done. So how can we know that the social worker ought to be moving forward and the teacher holding back? And then vice versa. How does that happen? So what kind of expertise is involved in this process? So that's what led to what I very pretentiously call relational turn. So I also found, fortunately, that these kinds of questions were also very much part of the zeitgeist in the first 10 years, at least, of this century. So here we've got two Norwegian researchers who are working in the field of business, who argue that this kind of horizontal working between agencies, and we can think about university departments and schools and communities as these agencies, if you like, in the same sense. Horizontal working between these agencies needs cooperative effort, absolutely. Cannot be imposed from the top down. And so the role of the successful reform agent is to operate as a gardener. Now I know some of you read the paper where I've talked about this. But so more as a gardener than as an engineer or an architect. And so what I'll go on to in a moment is talk about some of the tools, these gardening tools, that I've kind of extricated from the data and put labels on to see how useful they are. And I'd be interested also in your feedback when they make sense to you. But before I move on to talking about those tools, I just want to do another life's work on one slide. And this is Leon Terv. Leon Terv was a very close colleague of Vygotsky. And Vygotsky had died of TB in the mid-1930s, and when Stalin came to power around about 1929, the writing was on the wall for psychology in Russia. I've been in meetings in Moscow in a room about this size, and there are probably 20 photographs, mainly men, along the walls. And I've been told that every single one of them was poisoned during the early 1930s. And when I went to Red Square and could see the Kremlin, and across a very broad road, you can see where the old psychology department was, their beautiful old building. You can always see it sort of taunting the Kremlin with its sort of Northern European individualistic values as they would see it. And it was a dangerous place to be a psychologist. So what Leon Terv did was to take his team to Kharkov, so the safer side of the Urals. And whereas when he and Vygotsky had been working together, they were focusing very much on conceptual tools, developing conceptual resources, giving people the resources to change the world, etc. When he took his team to Kharkov, he shifted the focus slightly in some of the work that they did to talk about the object of activity. Now, I've already mentioned this, and a lot of you are familiar with Engestrom's work. But it was safer in many ways to focus on the tasks that people were doing and how people interpreted those tasks, than to be focusing more and more on the kind of Wundtian Northern German psychology that Vygotsky and others were associated with. So, this is a really almost a counterintuitive notion of motive. Some of you will be familiar with it, some of you may not, so I'll go through it fairly slowly. If we think of an object of activity, so in teacher education, the object of our activity might be the learning trajectory of a student or a group of students. So this is the problem space that we're working on. So the object of activity is what we're focusing our efforts on. But what happens is that when we look at that learner's trajectory, we look at it through the lenses of what matters for us. So as a teacher-educator, we might want to think, well, they've got a year or 2 years and we've got to get them to here. We might want to think about them playing, really recognising how important values play in being a professional. We'll have a lot of things that we will use when we look at that trajectory. So we're objectifying what matters for us, and that becomes the object motive for us when we are working on that learner's trajectory. So the object of activity is therefore seen by different actors in different ways. So in teacher education, is something that happens constantly. We will find as teacher educators, we might be worried about how far this physics student is actually managing some of the things that we think they ought to know. But the head teacher in the school in which they're in a placement says, oh, physics, I don't care how she teaches. I desperately need a physics teacher. I'm going to make sure she passes, and I'm going to keep her. So those kinds of things happen because the object motive is different. The head teacher is desperate for a physics teacher. And we can certainly see in homeschool work or in university community work, families might see the child as a breadwinner. This was certainly true in the Indian study I just mentioned. Whereas the school would see the child, for example, as a student. So the object motive is very different. And the relationship, the other thing to remember from Leontief's work is that the relationship between the actor and the object is always mediated by what matters. So I mean, that's the core message. So we read into things what matters for us. Okay, so that means we go back to Engestrom's triangles and sites of intersecting practices. These sites of intersecting practices are full of different object motives. So people come into them with lots and lots of different expectations, different purposes, and that's certainly true when you're thinking about working horizontally in the way that I'm going to be talking about. I just had an interesting discussion with Sue and Milo just now about actually how you move knowledge upstream as well. And it also applies when you're trying to work vertically up from the ground. The fact that everybody will have an object motive that comes out of the history of their practices, what matters for them in their practice, is absolutely crucial to what I'm going to do. Okay. So here's somebody else putting it much more simply. This is an educational psychologist in one of our research studies. She said we need to be looking more carefully, precisely at what difficulties exist and then recognise, just his language, paradigms, a whole range of professions and voluntary sectors want to work on. Education has its paradigm, medicine has its, voluntary sector social work, they have theirs. They inform how people operate and their expectations. So, yeah, I should have just put that one up first because he explains it so clearly. But that's really what I'm talking about. So, how do we deal with this then? So back in these sites of intersecting practices, bubbling away all these object motives, and professionals care. You know, things matter when you're a professional. Doing right by your students, whether they're kids in class or your teacher education students, matters. So similarly for parents who care about their children. So this is highly charged stuff. So coming out of looking at what seems to be working in these sites of intersecting practices, I've come up with these three concepts which I'll talk you through. I know some of you again have read them, but I'm just really talking through. The first one is relational expertise, and that involves knowing who, in addition to knowing what, why, and how. I'm a great Google searcher when I'm writing stuff, and I found that knowing how to know who was actually really important when you were collaborating and thinking about bringing in other resources to work on these complex problems with you. And I was absolutely delighted to find somebody called Lundvall, writing in Development Economics in Africa, talking about the need for knowing who as being as important as knowing what, why, and how. because it allows you to bring all these resources, and at times the resources are limited, to bring them together. But as well as knowing who, and knowing how to know who, it's important that that means that once we've got to know them or meet them, we need to recognise the standpoints and the motives of those who inhabit other practices. I've sometimes talked about that in terms of being professionally multilingual, being able to just understand that a psychologist is looking for a particular angle on something that would be different from what you as a teacher are looking for. And then relational expertise involves aligning motives in joint work. So all of these things come together. But really importantly, it's an additional form of expertise. It's not a substitute. And I did a study with teaching assistants who were given welfare responsibility in schools, and they were relying on relational expertise with no substantive expertise of their own. And that was frightening. That was scary stuff. Because they didn't have anything that they could offer in terms of their own expertise. But they could call on other people, but they couldn't make judgments about whether it was relevant or not. So it's an additional form of expertise that can be acquired and learnt. I think that's important. Here again, nice practitioner saying, be quiet, Edwards, I can say it much more simply. It's only a matter of adjusting what you do to other people's strengths and needs. But I think it also involves recognition. I think it's a little bit more than that. It involves being able to take the standpoint of the other, to recognise. Those of you who who work in feminist areas will know Ben Habib's work on discursive rationality. I think that kind of feeds into this really very, very nicely. Those of you who want to bring your business school along on this, again, it really fits with what is concerning a number of people in the business world. Here is just one example. I could have given you 10 of Moore and Bennington, the Warwick Business School in the UK. We'll talk about how businesses need to think about co-creating public value. And they've written a lot about this through closer linking of users and producers in creative joint development products and services. The Harvard business, Victor and Boynton, for example, are saying very, very similar things, and saying it for the past 20 years, about this kind of co-construction of knowledge. So what we're talking about is not something that's going on in little isolated bits among nice, kind education people. It's also out there in the world, and other resources we encourage you to look at. The second gardening tool, and this is where the Leonted work plays in, is common knowledge. Now Dave Middleton, great friend, has written about common knowledge in use in like a medical team, where you can be looking at a problem and you've been working together long enough to be able to say, oh, it's Mrs. Jones all over again. And everybody knows what that complication is and what they're going to do. Derek Edwards, again with Neil Mercer, another very, very good friend, has used common knowledge in a lovely book that's about to be reprinted as what teachers do. They build up understandings that then become a kind of basis for moving forward in the teaching session. Those are fine, and in fact, particularly Dave Middleton's work made me really think about what happens in sites of intersecting practices and what doesn't happen, because they haven't got that history. So they can't be talking about, oh, it's Mrs. Jones all over again. And they've got to do something else. They've got to contrive that common knowledge and find a way of making that common knowledge. So fascinatingly, it's Paul Carlisle's work in California. It's from a major ethnography he did of the semiconductor industry in California. That came across the nearest thing to the way I was seeing what I'm calling common knowledge being developed. And he was interested in an industry like the semiconductor industry. Knowledge is generated within units, and then it needs to move rapidly between units, which is what happens when a teacher and a social worker and a parent together. They've got to find ways of operating very, very quickly. And he came up with a nice kind of distinction. He said, if we want to be able to do that kind of knowledge transfer and in a sense, align what you're doing so you get on with the job working on a complex problem, then we need to try and aim at quick knowledge transfer. So if I said to Ken, what I want to talk about today is mediation, and he would, I think he'd understand I'm talking about mediation from the Vygotskian sense straight away, with transfer. If I said it to one of my English teaching colleagues, we're going to cover mediation today, he would take a step back, as he has, but it would take me 10 seconds to explain to him what I meant by mediation. If I sit down at the dinner table with my children and their husbands, and I start to talk about mediation, which I wouldn't dream of doing, because they would think I was talking about what was going on in the Middle East. You know, it would be we'd have to have a complete transformation. So what we want to do all the time is to get to the point where we've got translate. Translation we can live with, but we want really to get to the point we've got translate. And so we need that, and so when we're talking about bringing together these different practices to work on these complex problems, often, either in a lot of my work with vulnerable families and children, or in teacher education, when the student teacher may not be vulnerable in that sense, but it's a vulnerable time for them. You know, you've got to work quickly, you've got to find a way of working quickly. You want to try and think about bringing those different motives together, the motives of the teacher, the motives of the teacher educated together, so that what you get is enough understanding of what matters for each other in order to get that quick transfer. And here's Carlisle bringing, talking semiconductor industry, and he's talking about the capacity of common knowledge to represent the differences and dependencies now of consequence. I think that the emotional aspect of this is actually really very, very strong. So that's the second gardening tool, and it's built slowly. And you'll see when I get onto the Oxford example, quite how slowly that's built. So it's about recognising long-term, open, in the sense of motherhood and apple pie goals, such as we want the best teachers for our schools. It's about revealing what matters for us in conversations to talk about problems of practice. Ken earlier on was talking about things that are a project that's, or a big project that's working very well here, about how you can actually disagree. And that's what we've found. Being able to really disagree is actually very important. So being able to talk about the problems of practice, making what matters to you clear, and then listening to, recognising and engaging. So that part of the expertise that's involved is actually being a very, very good listener, and doing a lot of the kind of reflecting back to what matters in the conversations that you're having. But common knowledge becomes a resource that you can use outside the meetings when you're dealing with problems, when a student is failing, you get in there, you can have the conversation that allows you to work productively. So here's, and again, a practitioner saying, so the first, because of time, I'll just read the last bit. The first step is actually to get some shared understanding about effective practices, about understanding their reasons behind some of them. I'm happy to talk about reasons because something about reasons is really important, understanding the whys. And now the third gardening tool is the one I actually started with. And this is this notion of relational agency. And that's about, but I now think relational expertise and the building of common knowledge allows you to exercise relational agency. So it's about exercising relational agency. And that involves working with others to expand the object of activity. So suppose the object of activity is the learner's trajectory. Then relational agency allows you to look at the problem the student's having from the perspective of the school, the perspective of the student, the perspective of the university, understand the complexity of the problem, and then work together on it. It involves aligning one's own responses and being able to work together. So here we have a nice, simple manifestation of this. So here we have the graduate student teacher going out to change the world. And here we have the school. And you're looking at the learner's trajectory. When the school looks at the teachers in the school, what matters for them is the attainment of the pupils, staff recruitment and retention. Where the faculty looks at the learner's trajectory, they're thinking about successful program outcomes, probably strong research, and that trajectory then gets expanded, and the full complexity of it becomes revealed, and then they can think about ways of reacting to this particular student who she looks too happy to be having problems, but let's imagine that she's having problems. And so the problem can be seen in terms of both what matters for the school and what matters for the university, and the common knowledge, that understanding of what matters, allows you to mediate those differences and to expand the problem and respond to the problem. I've just put here areas where these ideas have been taken up utterly fascinatingly. I mean, the children's trajectories that I've done in my work, but other people have also now picked up in Australia particularly. In Finland, some of these come from Finland. In Finland, they've used it to think about prisoners' trajectories. So what are the different organisations that are focusing on prisoners as they move out from being in prison to leaving prison? What's involved in that, and how do they negotiate? What kind of common knowledge do they need to build? How do they use it in order to smooth that transition for the trajectory? Fascinatingly, they're using it in terms of fluency in rail traffic in Helsinki. So how do they organise rail traffic so that it actually aligns with the bus services in central Helsinki? This is the Finnish Institute of Occupational Health. Common assessments, I've used it in terms of thinking about how assessments done within the community on vulnerable children, and so on and so on. So whenever there's a problem that involves a number of people from different practices, one can think about identifying what matters, how the problem is expanded, and how the problem is responded to, and how both those processes are mediated by the common knowledge. But what's really important, and again, an example from a research project, that if you're making the problem more complex, but you're actually making your job more simple. Because this is a social worker talking about the importance of sharing out responsibilities. Again, they were using these ideas to rethink how they were working in social work practice. It's about sharing out of responsibilities. You're not on your own dealing with this. Everybody's got responsibilities. Everybody will go away and do their jobs and bring it back, and you're not on your own. This is a senior social worker, and she's constantly saying, "Now I'm not on my own," which is actually quite heartbreaking. You don't feel you're isolated and on your own. So she's able to be a social worker and not take on the other kind of dross that got thrown at her, and also felt that she was being supported in doing it. So that's the kind of theoretical background to it. I'm now going to take you through a fairly short example of how we've been using those ideas in Oxford. And I realise that I've used this slide before, because Commonwealth, when you're outside the UK, it makes you want to duck and cover and say, no, I don't mean colonisation. I mean Commonwealth, in the sense that when we had our Civil War back in the 17th century, the Roundheads were creating the Commonwealth. And that's about bringing together the resources, the Commonwealth, together. So that's really what's been lying behind when we think about this, because there are a lot of resources in Oxford, as you can imagine. The university looks like this university. But also there are community resources, there are resources in the schools. And this school is in a very deprived area. It's Boeing school, about 4 miles from there. So it's a very mixed area with a lot of resources that are actually probably being underused. So, when I became head of department, director of department in January 2010, I knew that I was going to have to, talking about dross, I was going to have to deal with a huge amount of usual kind of dross that comes your way. But I also thought, hey, I can actually do something I've been wanting to do for the last 20 years. So, we have a very strong partnership relationship that we have. This is what we say. Going back to the late 1980s, and the Oxford internship is his flagship teacher education program. But going back to the 1980s, and this is pivotal, really crucial, because I think it was exceptionally strong partnership program during the late 80s and the 90s, probably into the beginning of this century. But people retired. And so those relationships that had been built up no longer existed. And I'd come from 2 other universities where we had teacher education programs, and I really could not, when I joined the department in 2005, I could not see how it was any different from anything any of the rest of us were doing elsewhere. So we had a strong partnership, and we do have schools that have been with us for a very, very long time. But I don't want you to think what I'm going to talk about has come out of actually, the Oxford Partnership as a flagship program. I think we were not a flagship program in that sense in 2010. We were outstanding in terms of every grading. I must say my colleagues are absolutely brilliant at what they do. So we were absolutely outstanding in terms of all the inspection gradings. But in terms of partnership, we were not. That's really no different. So, I became head of department in January, and in February I invited all the head teachers in our partnership schools to dinner, and we have a college next door to us, so we could just go from the department to the college and have a college dinner with canapes, etc., etc. But I said there's no such thing as a free meal, so you're going to have to come listen to me for an hour, or have a discussion now, me for 10 minutes. And the date is important because it was February 2010. Our appalling right-wing government came into power in May 2010. So this is not a reaction to them. This is really quite important to say that. And so sitting in a room like this, head teachers there, a few of my colleagues with me, and I say, thinking they're going to, I thought I'd just start with something light and they'll all laugh at me and then we'll unpack it. So I said, well, what I've been thinking about doing is setting up a multi-layered system of distributed expertise. And I could see my colleagues go, oh, she's off again. Every single head teacher said, yes. They got it straight away. I mean, I didn't use this diagram. And the room ignited. And they, whenever, we get together as groups now, they still remember that moment. And they all went, yes. And we were lucky, there were a number of new head teachers, and a lot of the old guard had retired as well. So people were ready for actually thinking about it. The thing is that also that they could immediately see that if we start thinking about the expertise that's distributed around the system, at a time of shrinking resources, it's really helpful to be thinking about how you can draw on those other resources. So this is my subsequent rather primitive representation of what we have. But we talked about, well, we've got expertise in initial teacher education, both in schools and in the universities. So the knowledge of both really counts. We've got expertise in teacher and school development in both places. And we've got expertise in research in both places, different kinds of expertise. The research element really very important for us too, in terms of thinking about if we're going to do research in an education department and not a sociology department or a psychology department, we need to do research that makes a difference. And we need to be forward-looking in our research. And so that was that particular kind of pedagogic research that was forward-looking that we were particularly talking about. So off we went, and we had endless discussions, several years with different head teachers, a year and a half. And the more we talked about it, the more other people got interested. So I was in the little area of the university where all the pro-vice-chancellors sit with the vice-chancellor and make decisions that they tell us about later. And waiting to go in. And the registrar saw me there and said, "Oh, gosh, you can help me." The Minister for Education, who was an Oxford alumnus, has been speaking to the Vice-Chancellor and wants us to set up a school, because they wanted universities to set up schools at that particular time. And he said, "We don't want to do it." He said, "What do you think?" I said, "Well, we absolutely don't want to do it either, we've been asked." And I said, "But we've got this other thing which we think is much better." And so I just ran it past him, and he became so excited. Why did he become so excited? Because it fitted his practice. It fitted with his motives. Because his motives were about breaking down the barriers between the elite university and a city that's full of social need. And he was leading on that. As this then got talked about more and more in the university administration block, it linked also into the fact that we need to show that we're not the elite institution we probably really are, and think about how we widen participation, make access easier, etc. And it played into those agendas too. So I sometimes think it's like flypaper, that kind of sticky stuff that things stick to. But it's because we were open enough in what we were trying to do. And in these conversations that we were having, I used to drive the head teachers completely mad. They used to get quite cross with me because I would say it. We called it the Education Deanery in the end as a name, but I kept saying it, and they'd say to me, "But what's it?" And I'd say, "What would you like it to be?" "No, but what is it?" And I said, "Well, we're still creating it. I want to know what you'd like it to be." Yes, probably easily 2 years of that. And I think that was very, very important, because whose knowledge counts? We wanted their knowledge. We wanted the schools to play into creating what the it was. So we recognised that there are different partners will have different purposes: school outcomes, teacher retention, good quality research, excellent human teachers, good quality social services. And we wanted to create it, the deanery, as a site of intersecting practices, where different motives, where what matters for each practice is made clear and respected, and that's what we wanted to do. And my very good colleague Ian Mentor arrived about a year into all of this, and he took on the leadership of the deanery, and he's been really terrific at going very slowly and very patiently eliciting the what matters and making sure that it gets heard. So in one of these meetings with a head teacher who was getting increasingly irritated with me, I mean, she always greets me with a hug and a kiss whenever I walk into a school, so I'm not that irritated, but it was that kind of family irritation by then. She said, "Okay, sit down, right, sit down at that table, here's some paper, here's a pencil, I'm going to tell you what I think we're going to be doing." Phew, success. So she dictated to me the principles, and here they are, the principles for the deanery, for the it. And this was really what we've been waiting for, which was that they didn't come from us. Investment in the future, the teaching profession doing high quality research. So by then she really recognised what mattered for us. Developing the best subject pedagogy, working with young people to sustain their engagement, creating strong learning environments, etc. You can see all of these. When we have a sort of set of committees and steering groups and things, and it went through them, so it's been tweaked a bit from the time that Catherine sat me down with a pencil and maybe write the list. But that's really what we've been working on, and it has not come from us. I think that's absolutely crucial. But it's taken a lot of time, huge amount of time. So the first step then was setting up that system, and then we had to do some things, and we had to build common knowledge by working together. So here are just some of the things that we've done. Collaborative research. We set up a system of action research fellows. Well, that was set up by the City of Oxford, and they support between 15 and 20 action research fellows every year. It's now in its 4th year. Two or three in each of the schools that have taken part in it. Joining meetings to test out ideas. I found that so useful. Existing teachers' meetings, for example, on how they're implementing the new special education needs policies, meeting every 6 weeks. We've had projects that have been relevant to that particular group, and they've done critical reading of our reports, helping us identify things that we haven't seen when we plan projects. That's been absolutely terrific. You think you're going in for sort of an extra half an hour with them, you could still be there another 2 hours or so. Because the knowledge flow is just so phenomenally useful for all of us. A project that came out of that particular meeting was about, which has now got funding, which is about teachers of the law, which is bringing in the law department. And so on. You can see these things. Supporting changes in schools, helping teachers to negotiate new findings in school systems. I've been supporting action research for years. I've never been in a position before to help people take those ideas forward in the school system. And I think the Deanery has opened up that kind of space for that. Supporting outreach, contributing. We have a lot of teacher-led teach meets. I got an email day before yesterday from one of the action research fellows who'd worked with me. She's now organising a teacher meet in the education department, not in her school, and she wants us to do a joint presentation. So that's a real shift in power, isn't it, when we think about some of these material aspects, and so on. There's loads and loads and loads. So, but what was happening in all of those was we were getting to understand what matters for each other. Very practical things, nothing particularly revolutionary. I'm sure you've got examples for all of those in your own experiences. Step 3, we're now recognising there are some specific problems that we want to work on. So we've created a 5-year programme for newly qualified teachers in the city. That's come out of those discussions, and that's been done jointly. We've got which I find it absolutely lovely, the shared discourse about learning across the schools and university, and so important for helping students make that move between university and school. And of course, coming back to this thing about demands in practices, sharpening the kind of demands that are being made. We have in the department every Monday evening what we call the public lecture. Well, up until we started, the Deanery got going, the other people who came were mainly, well, it was departments, the students, but and then a few other people from the rest of the university. Now more and more teachers are coming to those meetings. They feel they own, they've got right of entry into the department of school, and so on. More school involvement in research advisory panels, lots and lots of things that we do. We're actually doing things together now, very, very easily. And each school is now, in Oxford at least, and a number of other schools around our partnership, have put in place a research champion, who is the point of contact for any kind of research activity. So these, we've used those gardening tools in terms of developing the Oxford Education Deanery. So why do it? Why do we bother? It's allowed us to make our shared values explicit. And that's been really important for getting over the us and them aspects that were there even in the partnership we have. I think we're doing more relevant research. Education research is roundly criticised for looking backwards in the UK. And actually what we're able to do now, something that I think has been very important for me for a long time, is actually working with the professionals' anticipation. So a new set of regulations for special education needs coming in you sit with a group of teachers who have really thought about the implications of that, and you learn so much as a researcher in terms of what you might want to be exploring with them as it's being implemented. Feeding current research, very, very important. What we're doing through all of this is feeding current research immediately back into practice. Easier transition, as I've said before, between practices for student teachers, and attention to the demands in the practices, and attention to the learning dialectic. And that comes back to that kind of shared discourse as well. So when we're talking about assessment for learning, I'm not saying this is perfect everywhere, but there is a stronger sense of what assessment for learning might be in some of the schools where we've done projects on assessment for learning with the teachers. That just as one example. And I think, what for me I think is great, and it goes back again to what I was talking with Ken about earlier, you can disagree. It becomes kind of like family disagreements. You're recognising that knowledge in different practices is simply different. And the hierarchy is lost in this kind of hybrid space that I think we've jointly created with the teachers and schools in Oxford. So that's why I do it. I really do think it's worthwhile doing. I've not talked about money, I've not talked about anything of the grit of all of this, but so you might like to ask me some of those questions. But that's my answer to my homework.
Thank you very much. We have till 1 o'clock, so floor is open. Comments, questions? Cap?
I thank you so much. This has been thrilling, and you're raising issues that are so important, and we've historically not devoted enough attention to the relational dimension of the work. But as I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking about where we have made progress, where we've made our own ventures in this country around these kinds of agendas. Thinking about the Holmes Group work, I'm thinking about John Goodlad's work.
Oh, yeah.
And both of those issues shared a lot of features here.
Yeah.
And I was also thinking about those triangles, so I'm about to reveal how stuck in the triangles I still am. And I'm noticing that the progress that you're describing kind of has to do with the inner triangles, the inner part of the triangles, the subject-object community. But I would actually raise the question about whether these initiatives tend to die on the outer points of the triangles. And so here are a couple of examples about it. Tools. We are still lodged in the university practices around tools for evaluating professorial productivity. The coursework evaluations, there's an example. So the way we look at our productivity as teachers is primarily situated in our individual courses. Haven't been able to change that typically. Rules and regulations around tenure and promotion. Terrible problem, and one that I think has bedeviled these kinds of initiatives in the past. And then division of labor. We're still stuck in we pay the people who are closest to the action of learning to teach, i.e. field supervisors and cooperating teachers, the least. We pay them a trivial amount of money to participate in the work. So we haven't made, in this country, I'd say we haven't made much progress around those pieces of the system. And I'm really interested to hear what you've learned about how to work those problems, in addition to the relational problems in the work.
Okay. The department I'm in has a teaching staff overall of around about 45, 50, and then another sort of 20 research staff and then LP staff. And very, very few people who are paid on a part-time basis to help out with teachers' practice supervision. And we've made it really absolutely crucial that people work across the three main activities. Well, some people work across the three main activities. So three main activities are teacher education, master's and PhD, and research. And people will do that in different proportions. And not everybody will work on teacher education because they're not qualified to do that. But it's really important that our teacher education staff work in the other two. And they may not do as much big funded research projects, partly because it's hard to get funding for it, but they will still be research active. And so that's been absolutely crucial for us. So we haven't got the kind of distinctions that you're talking about.
And are those reflected in changes in your tenure and promotion policies?
Yes.
That's all.
Well, yes and no. As I mentioned earlier, the Research Excellence Framework in the UK has a 30% proportion of a department's profile is on impact. And so it's not just the sort of the glorious case studies that we present that get the very high ratings, but we also have to have a large proportion of it is actually having an impact strategy. Well, the Deanery is a very important part of our impact strategy. And we did extremely well. We were by far the top education department in the UK last time when the results came out in December. We just streets ahead of everybody else, which was absolutely lovely. But we have a very, very strong impact strategy. So that again also helps us. In terms of promotion, I could not have sold it to my colleagues if I didn't have research. And that research has, we do the best quality research, and so that wasn't in any way going to be compromised. And so the action research aspects fit in teacher and school development. And sometimes in collaboration in terms of initial teacher education as well. So we're pretty tough-minded about saying, hey, we're not going to compromise that. And we're very careful to recognise that some people coming into teacher education with their PhD in physics may not have got an apprenticeship as a social researcher. So we will put them into another research unit for some of their time, so they can be part of our assessment research unit, for example, in order to get that kind of apprenticeship that other people would have had in social research. So we trying to keep all the balls in the air, really. I think the situation is maybe harder here, and also I think there are other universities in the UK where it would be harder to do. I think it's you need to be a research strong university department in order to do this, I think. Yeah.
Somebody else? Jess?
So I'm curious about your teacher candidates that you're training through this kind of sub and this multi-dimensional layers of expertise. I'm curious to where those students are placed, where they find work later on in their induction process, if they're finding that they're going into schools where there is not as much a cohesion between the teachers in the schools and the university partners, and if they're floundering, or if you've been able to measure that in any way.
It's sad to say, I think the lack of cohesion is the norm across programs. Viv Ellis, who we mentioned earlier, had a very interesting project which was looking at the work of teacher education. And he found that a vast proportion of the time and effort of teacher educators across universities of all kinds across the UK was spent on trying to make these programs appear to be working. But when you actually dig, from my own students, when you dig down, you see that they haven't got the cohesion. So the big challenge then is to try and create that, not so much cohesion, because you don't want to stifle anything, but to make sure that the students are getting demands made on them that help them learn. So yes, students do flounder. What we are hoping and expecting, and we have anecdotal evidence, is that when the floundering happens, it's seen very much as a kind of joint responsibility of the school and the university. Not so much, in the past it's been a kind of question of university have got to sort this problem out. Now there is anecdotal evidence, not been systematic research on it. But there seems to be evidence that there are more conversations based on trust
When they're in their
around the student.
student teaching
Yeah.
capacity, is there anything about when they go in, beginning in their first years of teaching? So if they're going to a place where they haven't had that cohesion that they've found in their program, such as...
We haven't done that kind of research, no, we haven't.
All right, I'm going to jump in here and take progress. Even though I've left my 13 years of program administration behind me now, I have questions about, you referred to, well, we got a grant for this and a grant for that. Is this operation totally dependent on grants, or is there some projection to try to make it a sustainable, this sort of multi-level system, something that can be implemented, one, in other places that maybe don't have the resources of Oxford, and two, something that can exist over time?
The money question is really important. Well, the department's not, as I was saying to you, the department's not like any, our department's like any department in Birmingham or Leeds or anywhere else I've worked. We haven't got the great Oxford resources pouring gold into our coffers at all. We've got to, we've just got to make our books balance like any other department. So we toyed with asking schools to pay so many £1,000s a year into this, and the more we thought about that, we thought, no, it's the wrong way. And so we managed to do quite a lot by just using the resources that are there. So, if there's a meeting going on, we'll attend it and take some of our research along with it. The City of Oxford has got a sort of small linkage of schools, and they had some money that they could then pay for time for the actual research fellows. And they recognise they have to pay for their time, they recognise that. But what has the longer term sustainability and the growth of what we're trying to do beyond because we started really with 9 schools, and then other schools have joined in over time. If we want to have sustainability, we have to have much stronger infrastructure and administrative support, and because it fits with the university. And it is trying to sort of shake off its elite image. The university has just agreed to give us the money, and so we've been going for 5 years without additional funding. But it's just fitted into our work. It hasn't been extra work, and now the university is going to invest in us. Our Vice Chancellor, who's going to New York in September, to be president there, is very, very, very keen on it.
Any other comments or questions you want to throw out there? Macy?
So I thank you for sharing again, Professor Edwards. This idea of distributed expertise, is that also extended to the families and the communities who partake in the schools, and also the role of students as being seen as experts in the classroom, and whether that has happened we haven't, in a sense, because that's not our interface, but where schools have done this, and their schools are doing some of the actual research projects, for example, would be doing that kind of thing. Then we've supported the schools, but we haven't made it part of our interface. But some of the, for example, the student hub that I mentioned there is the student volunteers from across the university who are doing work in the community and are doing work in local schools directly with kids. And we're supporting them, but also they're also giving us lots of interesting ideas about and feeding into the university's interest in participation and access as well. So research projects and ideas are bubbling away as we work with people.
Do you have strategies for working with the turnover that happens in local schools or school districts as well as the university?
Yeah. One of the attractions for the head teachers was that they thought this kind of thing would keep the best teachers in their schools. And that was a major
in terms of a strategy, we haven't put it written into a strategy, but the 5-year programme for supporting newly qualified teachers is really geared up to them taking increasing responsibility within their schools, within a supported structure, for example. So there are things that we do which are aimed at keeping, as I said, the best teachers there. So we've got that interest. We want the best teachers in our local schools for our kids, and that's what's driving us all. But actually, I can't answer your question in terms of the specific